The echoes of celebratory gunfire in the streets of Frankfurt provided a jarring contrast to the heavy, stagnant silence inside the commandeered German mansion where the fate of the post-war world was being debated. By May 1945, the Third Reich had been reduced to smoldering rubble, its once mighty Wehrmacht shattered into remnants of starving prisoners and broken machinery, leaving a vacuum of power that stretched from the Rhine to the Vistula. While the American public was drowning in a wave of euphoria, convinced that the war to end all wars had finally reached its conclusion, the strategic reality on the ground was far more precarious. Two titans of the American military, Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton, sat across from one another, representing two fundamentally irreconcilable visions of the future. Eisenhower, the architect of the Allied coalition, viewed the end of hostilities as a mandate for peace and the beginning of a complex diplomatic era, whereas Patton, the visceral warrior, looked eastward and saw not an ally in the Soviet Union, but a predator poised to consume the very liberty they had just spent years fighting to restore. To understand the friction that defined this meeting, one must examine the psychological architecture of the two men. Eisenhower was a master of the long game, a man whose primary weapon was not the tank, but the committee, the telegram, and the compromise. He understood that the American industrial machine was weary, and that the political appetite for a continued presence in Europe was rapidly evaporating among a Congress and a public desperate for normalcy. Conversely, George S. Patton was a man of historical intuition, a student of ancient battles who believed that the momentum of an army was its most precious and fleeting resource. To Patton, Eisenhower's refusal to acknowledge the burgeoning Soviet threat was not merely a diplomatic choice, but a catastrophic failure of leadership that ignored the grim lessons of history. Patton saw the world through the lens of kinetic force, believing that the Red Army, though massive, was currently at its most vulnerable, stretched thin across hostile territories and lacking the sophisticated logistical tale that the Americans had perfected. As the maps were rolled out, the vague and shifting lines mentioned in intelligence reports began to take a terrifyingly concrete shape in Patton's mind as he received daily briefings on the conduct of Soviet troops in liberated territories. While the American media was still painting Joseph Stalin as Uncle Joe, a benevolent and rugged partner in the struggle against fascism, Patton's intelligence officers were documenting a far more sinister reality of mass deportations, systematic looting, and the brutal suppression of democratic movements. The Soviet Union was not merely occupying land. It was installing a totalitarian apparatus designed to endure for generations, effectively replacing one form of tyranny with another before the ink on the German surrender documents was even dry. Patton's fury was fueled by the realization that the American policy of cooperation was being interpreted by Moscow as a green light for expansion, a realization that turned his triumph over the Nazis into a bitter, hollow victory. Patton's argument for an immediate strike was not born of mere bloodlust, but of a cold-blooded assessment of the industrial and logistical disparity that existed in the spring of 1945. The United States possessed a total monopoly on nuclear weapons, an air force that could level entire industrial hubs at will, and a supply chain that remained untouched by the ravages of the conflict. In contrast, the Soviet Union had suffered a demographic catastrophe, losing 27 million people, with its heartland devastated and its frontline troops relying on requisitioned food and captured German stocks to survive. Patton insisted that if the United States did not utilize its peak strength now to force a Soviet withdrawal to their pre-1939 borders, they would eventually be forced to fight them decades later when the playing field was level and the stakes were nuclear. He argued that the cost of a 6-week campaign in 1945 would be a fraction of the cost of a 40-year Cold War, a calculation that was as mathematically sound as it was politically explosive. The moment Patton uttered the words, "We are going to have to fight them eventually," the trajectory of his career was irrevocably altered as he moved from the status of a national hero to that of a liability in the eyes of the Washington establishment. Eisenhower's response: "George, you do not understand politics. was the first stone in a wall of silence that would eventually entomb Patton's strategic warnings. This ideological clash marked the birth of the narrative that Patton was unstable or losing his grip on reality, a label used by his detractors to dismiss the uncomfortable truths he was presenting. By the end of this first confrontation, the stage was set for a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. A prophet of war who was silenced by the very peace he helped create, and a nation that would spend the next half-century paying the price for the fateful silence that followed in that quiet Frankfurt room. While the Western press glorified the Red Army as an unstoppable steamroller of men and steel, Patton's tactical assessment revealed a force that was internally fractured and mechanically exhausted. He observed that the Soviet armored divisions, though formidable in number, suffered from a lack of standardization and a crumbling infrastructure that made long-term occupation a logistical nightmare. The T-34 tanks that had terrorized the Germans were often operating on their last thousands of miles of engine life, with spare parts being salvaged from the debris of the battlefield rather than being supplied from the rear. Patton argued that the American M4 Sherman, supported by a superior network of maintenance battalions and a limitless supply of fuel from the Atlantic, possessed a sustained lethality that the Soviets could not match. He saw the Red Army not as a permanent superpower, but as a wounded giant that had used its last ounce of strength to reach Berlin, a giant that could be toppled with a swift, decisive blow before it had the chance to heal. Patton's urgency was further sharpened by the harrowing reports flowing from his G2 intelligence teams, who were witnessing the systematic Sovietization of Central Europe. Behind the thin veil of Allied brotherhood, Soviet trophy brigades were stripping occupied Germany and Czechoslovakia of everything from industrial lathes to livestock, sending the wealth of Europe eastward in a massive act of state-sponsored plunder. More disturbing were the human costs. Patton's officers documented widespread atrocities that suggested the Red Army was not interested in establishing a democratic peace, but a permanent, terrifying hegemony. By witnessing the summary executions of local leaders and the mass displacement of civilians, Patton realized that every day the Americans waited was another day the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, had to solidify its grip. This wasn't just a military concern for Patton. It was a moral emergency that demanded a reversal of the wait-and-see approach favored by Washington. Unknown to many in the American rank and file, Patton's madness was being echoed in the secret corridors of Whitehall by Winston Churchill himself. The British Prime Minister, a lifelong anti-communist who feared that the liberation of Europe was merely a change of masters, had already ordered his chiefs of staff to draft Operation Unthinkable, a contingency plan for a full-scale offensive against the Soviet Union. Churchill's planners reached the same sobering conclusion as Patton. If a conflict were to occur, it had to happen immediately, while the Western Allies still held the advantage in air power and naval supremacy. The British plan even considered the controversial necessity of utilizing rearmed German divisions to bolster the front line, a concept that Patton had advocated for with characteristic bluntness. This convergence of thought between America's greatest general and Britain's greatest statesman suggests that Patton was not a rogue element, but part of a minority of leaders who saw the Cold War coming before the hot one had even cooled. The most explosive element of Patton's strategy was his proposal to integrate surrendered Wehrmacht soldiers into the Allied line of battle, a move that felt like heresy to a world still reeling from the horrors of the Holocaust. Patton's logic was purely functional. He believed the Germans' specialized knowledge of Soviet tactics, gained through 4 years of brutal Eastern Front warfare, was a resource the Allies could not afford to waste. He famously remarked that he would rather have a German division on his side than a Soviet one, a statement that was stripped of its strategic context and used to paint him as a Nazi sympathizer. In reality, Patton's suggestion was a precursor to the eventual formation of the West German Bundeswehr during the Cold War. He was simply proposing in 1945 what would become standard NATO policy by 1955. However, in the emotionally charged atmosphere of May 1945, this cold-eyed realism was viewed as a betrayal of the Allied cause, further isolating Patton from the political mainstream. As Patton's calls for action reached higher into the halls of power, They hit a wall of institutional inertia and the cautious pragmatism of the new Truman administration. President Harry S. Truman, having inherited a global catastrophe following Roosevelt's death, was initially committed to the Grand Alliance and viewed Patton's rhetoric as a direct threat to the newly forming United Nations. The American military-industrial complex was already pivoting toward demobilization, with the Bring the Boys Home movement creating immense political pressure to end the war footing. Eisenhower, acting as the bridge between the military and the presidency, knew that endorsing Patton's views would mean a total collapse of the post-war diplomatic framework. This phase of the conflict was no longer about tanks and divisions. It was a battle of narratives, where the quiet, steady promise of peace was used to drown out the loud, abrasive warnings of the warrior who saw a storm on the horizon. As the summer of 1945 progressed, the American public's perception of George S. Patton began to undergo a calculated transformation. During the heat of the war, his eccentricities, the ivory-handled revolvers, the profanity-laced speeches, and his aggressive blood and guts persona were celebrated as the hallmarks of a quintessential American hero. However, once the German threat was neutralized, those same traits were weaponized against him by journalists and political rivals who viewed his anti-Soviet stance as a threat to global stability. The press, largely influenced by a Washington administration eager to maintain the facade of the Grand Alliance, began to portray Patton not as a visionary strategist, but as a loose cannon and a relic of a bygone era. The narrative shifted from his tactical brilliance to his perceived mental instability, creating a psychological barrier between the general and the people who had previously idolized him. The specific weapon used to facilitate Patton's removal was the highly sensitive issue of denazification. As military governor of Bavaria, Patton was tasked with the monumental job of rebuilding a collapsed society, a task he approached with the same pragmatism he used on the battlefield. He realized that if every person who had ever held a minor Nazi Party membership was removed from public service, the basic infrastructure of Germany, the water, electricity, and local administration, would remain in ruins, creating a breeding ground for communism. When he famously remarked to the press that the Nazi Party was just like a Democratic or Republican election fight back home, he was attempting to explain that for many low-level bureaucrats, party membership was a matter of professional survival rather than ideological fervor. However, in the wake of the liberation of the death camps, this nuance was lost. The quote was stripped of context and used as definitive proof that Patton was soft on Nazism. Dwight D. Eisenhower's role during this period remains one of the most debated aspects of Patton's downfall. While I personally respected Patton's combat record, his primary allegiance was to the political chain of command and the preservation of his own reputation as a statesman general. As the outcry over Patton's remarks reached a fever pitch in Washington, Eisenhower faced immense pressure from President Truman to take disciplinary action. Instead of defending his old friend's strategic insight or explaining the complexity of the Bavarian administration, Eisenhower chose a path of containment. He recognized that Patton's presence in a position of power was an obstacle to the delicate diplomatic dance with Stalin. By relieving Patton of his command of the Third Army, Eisenhower effectively cut the legs out from under the only man capable of mobilizing the Allied forces for the confrontation Patton believed was inevitable. The relief of command on September 28, 1945, was a death blow to Patton's spirit. He was transferred to lead the 15th Army, which was essentially a paper army tasked with writing a history of the war, a cruel irony for a man who thrived on action and movement. This was a deliberate exile, designed to keep him away from the front lines and the sensitive borders of the Soviet occupation zone. Patton understood exactly what was happening. He wrote in his diary that he was being kicked upstairs and silenced by men who were afraid of the truth. Stripped of his tanks and his men, Patton spent his final months in a state of growing frustration, watching from the sidelines as the Soviet Union solidified its Iron Curtain across Eastern Europe, exactly as he had predicted only months earlier in Frankfurt. In his private correspondence with his wife, Beatrice, Patton's tone shifted from tactical analysis to a haunting sense of prophetic despair. He lamented that the United States was winning the war but losing the peace, and expressed a deep fear that his country's naivety would lead to a future of unending conflict. He described the Red Army as a force that must be feared in any future rearrangement of world power, and expressed his heartbreak at seeing American-liberated cities being handed over to Soviet commissars. These letters reveal a man who felt a heavy, almost spiritual burden for the fate of Western civilization, a man who believed he was witnessing a historic betrayal of the millions of soldiers who had died for freedom. This internal turmoil set the stage for his final, fateful trip to Washington, a trip he would never live to make. On the morning of December 9th, 1945, the man who had survived the harrowing tank battles of North Africa, the treacherous shores of Sicily, and the freezing carnage of the Ardennes met his end not by an enemy shell, but by a 2.5-ton army truck. As Patton traveled toward a pheasant hunting trip near Mannheim, Germany, a truck suddenly swerved in front of his 1938 Cadillac. The collision was relatively low speed, yet its physics were uniquely cruel. While the other occupants of the car suffered only minor bruises, Patton was thrown forward, his head striking a metal part of the partition behind the driver. The impact snapped his neck, instantly paralyzing him from the neck down. This mundane accident felt profoundly wrong to those who knew him. It was as if the universe had conspired to remove a man who had become an inconvenient witness to the mounting failures of the post-war peace. For 12 days, Patton lay in a hospital bed in Heidelberg, his body a prisoner to paralysis, while his mind remained as sharp and aggressive as ever. Even in his final hours, he continued to question the officers who visited him about the movements of the Soviet units and the stability of the occupation zones. There was a haunting irony in his condition. The general who advocated for lightning-fast movement and kinetic action was now forced into a state of absolute stillness. He reportedly told his doctors, "This is a hell of a way for a soldier to die," acknowledging the bitter gap between his legendary life and his quiet, sterile end. On December 21st, 1945, a pulmonary edema and heart failure finally silenced the voice that the Washington establishment had spent months trying to muffle. Barely 3 months after Patton's burial in the American cemetery in Luxembourg, the world received a brutal wake-up call that validated every maniacal warning he had ever issued. In March 1946, Winston Churchill stood in a small college gym in Fulton, Missouri, and declared that an iron curtain had descended across the continent. The very cities Patton had begged Eisenhower to seize, Prague, Berlin, Vienna, were now being locked behind a wall of Soviet secrecy and repression. The Uncle Joe propaganda of the war years vanished overnight, replaced by the grim reality of the Cold War. The American leadership, which had relieved Patton for his aggressive stance, now found itself scrambling to adopt the very policy of containment he had proposed in the Frankfurt Mansion. The tragedy was that by 1946, the Soviet Union was no longer the exhausted, bleeding force of 1945. It had consolidated its gains, secured its borders, and begun the process of industrial recovery. The strange circumstances surrounding Patton's death have fueled decades of conspiracy theories, ranging from NKVD assassinations to internal cleanup operations by Western intelligence. While no definitive proof of foul play has ever been found, the anomalies are difficult to ignore. The truck driver's inconsistent testimony, the disappearance of the official accident report for years, and the fact that several other accidents had allegedly targeted Patton in the months prior. Even if one accepts the event as a tragic accident, the geopolitical timing was impeccable for Moscow. With Patton gone, the loudest and most respected voice calling for a military rollback of Soviet influence was removed from the chessboard. Whether by divine tragedy or human design, his death ensured that the Grand Alliance could collapse into the Cold War without the interference of a general who was willing to strike first. By 1948, the Patton prophecy reached its terrifying zenith with the communist coup in Czechoslovakia and the subsequent death of Jan Masaryk. The very community of Prague, which Patton's tanks could have easily liberated in May 1945 had he not been ordered a halt, was now a dark outpost of the Soviet Empire. When the Berlin blockade began later that year, the United States was forced into the Berlin airlift, a massive, expensive, and risky humanitarian mission to save a city that Patton had argued should have been secured by force 3 years earlier. The cost of peace in 1945 had become a permanent state of nuclear anxiety. As the first Soviet atomic test loomed in 1949, the window of opportunity Patton had described closed forever, leaving the world to wonder if a 6-week campaign in 1945 would have been a smaller price to pay than the 40-year standoff that followed. In his final act of defiance against the grandiosity of the military establishment, George S. Patton requested to be buried not in the hallowed grounds of Arlington or a monumental tomb in the United States, but among his men. He lies today in the American Cemetery in Luxembourg, his headstone facing the graves of the soldiers of the Third Army who fell during the Battle of the Bulge. This choice was a testament to his belief that a general's identity is inseparable from the flesh and blood of those he commands. Even in death, he remained on the front line of the Europe he tried so desperately to save from a second curtain of tyranny. To the thousands of visitors who walk those rows of white crosses every year, Patton's presence serves as a silent reminder that the war didn't truly end in 1945. It merely changed its face, shifting from the roar of the Tiger tank to the quiet, suffocating oppression of the Stasi and the KGB. The story of Patton in 1945 is a classic case study in the great man theory of history, the idea that the singular will of an individual can alter the destiny of nations. Patton's tragedy was that he possessed a vision that was too clear for the comfort of his contemporaries. In the halls of power, the truth-teller is often treated with more hostility than the enemy, because the truth demands action, sacrifice, and the abandonment of comfortable illusions. By labeling Patton as dangerous or unstable, the leaders of the 1940s were able to justify their own passivity. This pattern has repeated throughout history, from Churchill's wilderness years in the 1930s to modern intelligence officers' warning of emerging threats today. The world often punishes the prophet for the message, only to build monuments to them once the disaster they predicted finally arrives. The decades following Patton's death saw the fulfillment of his most cynical forecasts in a series of bloody, expensive, and inconclusive proxy wars. From the frozen ridges of Korea to the humid jungles of Vietnam, the United States found itself fighting the very communist expansionism Patton had wanted to decapitate in its cradle. The trillions of dollars spent on the nuclear arms race and the millions of lives lost in ideological conflicts were the interest paid on the missed opportunity of 1945. It wasn't until the 1980s, when leaders like Ronald Reagan adopted a Patton-esque stance of moral clarity and military buildup, that the Soviet system finally began to buckle under the pressure Patton had advocated 40 years earlier. When the Berlin Wall finally fell in 1989, it was a delayed victory for the spirit of 1945, proving that the Soviet Empire was indeed a force that could be broken, just as the general had insisted in the Frankfurt Mansion. Today, the debate ignited by Patton echoes in the West struggle to respond to the rise of new global rivals and regional autocracies. The fundamental question remains unchanged. Is it better to confront a threat early, while you possess the clear advantage, or to pursue engagement and diplomacy in the hope that the rival will moderate? As we witness the expansion of influence in the South China Sea or the resurgence of conflict in Eastern Europe, the Patton versus Eisenhower dynamic is more relevant than ever. Modern policymakers are still caught between the warrior's instinct to crush a vulnerability and the politician's burden to avoid immediate conflict at all costs. Patton's ghost haunts every situation room where leaders must decide if they are witnessing a partner in peace or a conqueror in waiting. Ultimately, George S. Patton was more than a commander of tanks. He was a sentinel of the Western conscience. He was a man who understood that peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of justice and the security of freedom. His removal from command and his subsequent death marked the end of an era of blunt honesty in American leadership. As the credits roll on this investigation into the war that never was, we are left with a sobering realization. The most dangerous thing a leader can do is see the future too clearly. Patton's voice still echoes through the corridors of history, a permanent warning that those who refuse to face the gathering storm in the afternoon will be forced to fight for their lives in the darkness of the night. His legacy is not found in his ivory-handled revolvers or his colorful speeches, but in the cold, hard reality that sometimes the madman is the only one who is truly sane.